a three-part Zoom series presented by the Department of Film, Television, and Theater. Thank you for joining us as we begin a period of self-reflection and the essential work of creating an anti-racist theater department in both policies and practices. My name is Siiri Scott. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the head of acting and directing here in the theater department. I have two guests today who are both ND alums, Rachel Lynett, who graduated in 2011, and Joe Wilson, who graduated in 1993. Our webinar today will consist of a series of questions tailored to the issues at Notre Dame and in the professional theater at large. We all know that we are in a broken system right now, and it's not going to repair itself. We're going to need help. So how do we, in the middle of a charged political climate, a global pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, begin to dismantle a system that isn't serving all the members of our Notre Dame family? What does it mean to burn it down, which is my favorite phrase? How do we do it? How do we take it apart? And then how do we rebuild it? And who does that labor? So before we meet our panelists, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. They're going to have a conversation with us about their experiences in professional theater and at Notre Dame, both positive and negative, what their suggestions are for us here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'd like to hear about their hopes for the future of the landscape of the new American theater. We want you to be a part of this conversation. So before we meet the panelists, Gabe Crute from Platform, which is the webinar, the company hosting our webinar, he's going to jump on and explain to you how you can submit questions for our panelists. Gabe?
Hey there, thanks, Siiri. Hi, my name is Gabriel Crute. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a current student here at the University of Notre Dame. And the way that we want to get audience engagement and feedback, there's a live chat in YouTube, which you're more than welcome to use to respond. But we also have the opportunity to submit anonymous questions, if that's something you're more comfortable with. We'll be sending a link in the chat to a service called onlinequestions.org. All you have to do is put in the event number, which is today's date, 10/23/20, and you'll be able to post anonymous questions that Siiri will be able to pose to our panelists. So toss it back to you, Siiri. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Gabe. I'm going to have you repeat one more time what you put into the beginning, because I know that I don't remember anything you just said.
Oh, good. It'll be in the chat too, in case you forget. But today's date, 10/23/20, to onlinequestions.org.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabe.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves so that you don't have to listen to me read their bios. Guys?
I guess I'll go.
Yeah, please.
So I'm Rachel Lynett. I am class 2011. My pronouns are she, her, hers, or they, them, theirs. I said that already, that I graduated in 2011. And when I was at Notre Dame, I kind of did this like weird thing where I kind of dorm jumped. And so like my first year I was in Pangborn. My second year, I think it was called McGlynn. I don't remember what that dorm's called anymore. And then my third year I was in Lyons. And then I moved off campus for my fourth year. I also I like to joke that I was a bouncer at Legends. That's my Notre Dame story. While I was at Notre Dame, I was primarily focused on stage management. Since leaving Notre Dame, I'm probably more a playwright and producer. I also teach here at UW Wisconsin, UW-Madison. And what else should I talk about? Yeah, so
that's good.
Great.
Yeah, perfect. Joe?
Hey, everybody. Again, my name is Joe Wilson, Jr., and I could not tell you how I get emotional, because I always do, how grateful I am to be here speaking to you all, because Notre Dame changed my life. My experience started as a kid coming out of New Orleans, and I ended up going to Notre Dame, and I graduated in 1993 with a BA in government or political science. And I had every intentions of going on to law school and eventually running to be the governor of Louisiana. Obviously, I didn't do that. But, you know, I was, over the course of my time at Notre Dame, I always found myself in activist spaces and through my studies in terms of government, whether that be serving on the student senate, or whether that be trying to introduce, for the first time, I believe my first year being on the student senate, I introduced or tried to introduce legislation that would recognize National Coming Out Day. Even though I wasn't out at the time. So I was always in these activist spaces. And over the course of my time there, you know, I began to have a series of conversations with lots of people. And to make a long story short, and I have to tell you this through story form, to make a long story short, in my junior year, with the support of many of the students and allies and alumni, we actually shut the Golden Dome down for a day. I was part of a group called the Students United for Respect. And we had about 500 of us. And, to continue to move the story forward, they threatened to kick us out if we didn't go, and they called all of our parents. But I'm happy to say that 10 years later, when my brother came to Notre Dame, many of the things that we initiated and talked about wanting to have happened, like Office of Multicultural Affairs and dealing with issues around Black student and teacher retention and recruitment. But that all said, I was so sort of tired in my junior year, and I was going to law school. I didn't want to mess up my GPA. And so I took an acting class, and that changed my life. And so I was a major in government who ended up going to graduate school in acting. I didn't go to law school. I went to the University of Minnesota Guthrie Theater Training Program and got my master's degree in acting. And from that point on, I worked in Minneapolis for many years at the Guthrie Theater, the Penumbra Theater Company. Worked in New York. I've worked on and off Broadway. My last Broadway show was actually in 2018. I was in the Broadway company of Iceman Cometh. And I have been now for 16 seasons, a member of the resident acting company at Trinity Rep in Providence, Rhode Island. As well, I'm an assistant professor of theater and the a resident artist at Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts, as well as I do adjunct work at Emerson College in Boston. And again, I couldn't be happier to be here and to speak about my experiences, both as a professional, but also in terms of my time at being at Notre Dame. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. In terms of like the emotional part of this, I feel like even just in my intro, the work is so important and it means so much to us, whether it's about theater or about BIPOC artists, that I imagine emotion is welcome in this space today. Is there anything about your experience at Notre Dame, particularly in theater? I know, Joe, you would have been with me, so it would have been the COF department, which was communications and theater. And Rachel, you would have been later when I was there as a professor. But is there anything about some of your experiences in the theater department that you wanted to share?
Well, I guess I'll start. It's interesting because I actually want to go backwards. The theater department became in many ways a beacon for me. Because as I was grappling with my sexuality and dealing with my otherness in terms of being in the culture of Notre Dame, that space became a really safe space for me, oddly enough. And I think that the art form was so new to me that the way it rattled around in me intellectually and spiritually is that I knew how it made me feel. But what I will say is, I lived in Grace Hall, giving shout outs to dorms. I lived in Grace, which is no longer a dorm, I believe. And
No.
we very proudly sported the #1 whenever we were ranked #1 in the country. But I lived in a 6-man suite at Grace.
Oh.
One of my
What
first,
floor? Wait, what floor?
I believe it was the 11, one of the top
11. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of my first experiences in Notre Dame, because for any of you who are on this talk today who are BIPOC and specifically African-American people, we all know that over the course of our lifetime, our hair goes through many transitions. And doing so often requires extra attention and things and products. And, one of my first experiences there in my 6-man suite was the 6 members of my suite who were all white, and I was the only African-American. They thought it would be funny to take all of my hair care products and put them out into the hallway and put a sign on them commenting about the novelty of them. And that was my first experience, I think, in a real way of being just at Notre Dame and feeling like other, and not really knowing how to talk about it, who to talk to about it, where to put my outrage. But I channeled that into all the work that I did there. I think that over the course of my time in the theater department, I had a chance to step into many parts, and my time at the theater department mirrored the kind of pedagogy that I would then experience at a place like the University of Notre Dame, in which the teaching was very much in a white Western aesthetic of, you talk about the canon of who's in the canon, the Shakespeare's, the Thornton Wilders, all these folk. And then you talk about the pedagogy, the Uta Hagens and the Stanislavskis and all these things. And so over the course of my time, what I've come to understand about my pedagogy is I've had to do a certain level of decolonization, because I come to realize over the course of my career that as an African-American man, that as everyone's talking about breaking me down as an actor and bringing me to a place of neutral and colorblind casting, that no matter what, I was always asking myself fundamental questions about what it meant for me to exist in my body in this play. That the first time I played Mercutio and I had to say, "Zoons, what? Dost thou make minstrels of us?" That resonated for me in a very different way. And so, I didn't really know how to ask those questions then at Notre Dame, but I grew to understand that those are very important questions indeed to ask. But I have to say that my frame on my experience in the theater department was one where I was able to really spread my wings, for lack of a better metaphor. And I'm grateful for that. But I also realized that in my own life, I've had to do a certain amount of my own work to understand my privilege and decolonize myself in terms of what was and what I am allowing myself to be able to see and then to express. And so I'm just trying to acknowledge that part of my process and know that there may be people on campus who may be having a very similar experience as that, not really knowing what they're in the moment, but with time, you begin to understand how those things serve as building blocks and foundations of who you are and what ultimately you have to deconstruct.
And I think one of the things we can do for our students, and we're trying to do right now, I am in particular, is to give them language to talk about it. Because when I was a student before you, I didn't have the language to talk about it. Rachel?
Yeah, my time was a little different. So as a student, so I was there from 2007 to 2011. And I remember it's funny because a friend of mine and I would talk about how we grew up in California and race wasn't an issue. It's all about class. And so we just weren't really used to some of the questions we got asked. I remember this one, a student who was a classmate of mine asked me, she was like, "I didn't know Black people went to college." And that was my first week at Notre Dame. And I was like, where am I? And everyone wanted to touch my hair. It was very surreal. And I was should I go backwards in time? And I kind of felt I was really lost, I think, of what I wanted to do. I kind of had to fail a lot of majors before I came to FTT. And once I finally got to theater, since I got there so late, it felt like a club that I never got to fully be a part of. But like all type A students, I would listen to cultural references, and then I would go home and Google them and study them so that I could talk to the kids that were white, to be honest. So things I didn't grow up listening to Billy Joel, but they would mention Billy Joel so much that I went home, I went back to my dorm and downloaded all of his discography and listened to all the songs because I'm that type A, even though I didn't know I was type A at the time. And I remember there was another joke about the JT, not Justin Timberlake, the real JT. And I was like, there's another JT. So I had to go home and Google James Taylor and whose music I hate, but I had to pretend, I pressured to pretend to because I was I just want these people to talk to me. So yeah, my experience was just very I felt I had to relearn a culture that wasn't mine on top of learning my classes. And even sentences professors would make, I'd be I don't know what that means. And everyone else would be oh, now I get it. And I just would feel so bad that I was the only one that didn't. And then I've learned a lot about some class changes that have happened at Notre Dame that have made me really happy. But at the time when I was there, the only class that we had that wasn't typical Western theater was Latin American theater. And I found myself really attached to that. And I remember I still study it now and I teach it now because it was the only way to not have to study Shakespeare. And so just having the option of, and the fact that I didn't take a class on African-American theater or drama until grad school is really heartbreaking. And then again, I fell in love with it so much that I also now teach that. That's what I'm teaching right now. And just not being able to find myself in any of the text, reading the plays and having the as if moments and being I cannot relate to this. This is not a situation that's happened to me. And then watching many of my white classmates connect to it. And then for me, even just feeling I had to choose, being multicultural is a different experience that's layered in this as well, of you have to choose which race you want to be. And so I didn't even bring up that I was Latina at all at Notre Dame, really. I just didn't start talking about it until grad school because it just felt well, I'm already so much of an outsider. I just want friends because I'm an extrovert and I need them. I'm just going to say I'm just Black and I'm just going to roll with that. And I'm going to Google James Taylor and Billy Joel and that other and Queen. I just was like, who are these people? And that's kind of like how I figured out how to survive. But I truly got really good at studying my classmates that it took away from studying my coursework.
Well, that's kind of what I was thinking. It's like a dual cultural competency thing that's going on right now. Like you're trying to catch yourself up here and take your classes at the same time in order to have, I mean, who doesn't want to have friends in college, right?
And I was working. So there's also that too. Like
Yeah.
I worked nights. I worked from, well, we'll get to that later, I'm sure, but I worked from like 10 p.m. to 4 a.m.
Right.
every weekend.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that, which is to do that along with the whole day and rehearsal and running off to go and do that. I think the requirements are simply different. The requirements of BIPOC students at Notre Dame are not the same as the requirements of our white students. Moving us back into kind of the professional theater realm a little bit, I sent Joe and Rachel an article from the LA Times that was sent to me by a friend and another theater director entitled 40 Black Playwrights on the Theater Industry's Insidious Racism. And we'll include a link to that article in the chat. I'm gonna say it was a painful read. Took me kind of to stop for a little while, come back to it because it's 40 playwrights, so it's 40 different stories. But after some reflection, I took it more like as more of an opportunity to listen to some of these amazing artists, give voice to the reality of their experience in the American theater. So I'm wondering if Joe and Rachel would be willing to talk about the effects of racism, microaggressions. We've already mentioned a couple overtly racist and some microaggressions in this conversation, but and also some racist policies and what the effect of that is on your work and your creativity. Because it's hard enough. Rachel talked about trying to learn about this music, trying to do this, trying to do that, trying to work, trying to go to class. And then what's left? What time is left? What energy, what brain space is left for creativity at that point? You guys want to share anything?
Well, actually, God, Siiri, that's a really, really big question. You know, my experiences of it have been varied. You know, I've worked in the commercial world of the theater. I've worked now in the regional world of the theater. And of course, I mean, we all have, well, maybe we all shouldn't be so presumptuous. We all have those stories about being in a casting room and someone literally saying, can you do that a little more Black to someone who is Black? You know, I mean, but something as direct as that, but also as maybe not so as overt, but you know, being the only person of color in white spaces. And it's like you can be in an institution and they're asking all the Black people about, you know, well, how do we do Black hair? And it's like, well, you should have known that already, that should be part of your work. Or even, you know, comments around, I mean, the list goes on. I mean, I remember a casting I went to, and it was for a musical called Fela that was on Broadway a few years ago, and by a Nigerian, it was based on the life of a Nigerian musician. And, you know, when you get acutely also aware of color and colorism, as we all are as people of color, but you become acutely aware of too, of how I've become acutely aware of how my light skin has afforded me certain privilege when it comes to my darker skinned brethren in this business, okay? And that's a real thing. But on the other side of that, you know, you go to casting and it's for this person who is who he is ethnically and presents the way he does. That's not a part that I should be playing. But you know, there's this thing about, you know, it's like interchangeable. It's like a Black person is a Black person, parts is parts, and that's not the case. And so there is this general blatant characterization around BIPOC people. That started even what we didn't understand, that when we were in this world of trying to open up the American theater, the regional theater was created as a way to be a response to not being a commercial entity like the Broadway, like the West. But the systems that we built were still the same systems in the mode of those systems that we created. Yes, we had terms like a colorblind casting or cross a non-gender specific casting, but that's almost kind of gone in the way of how effective EDI was in many ways. It's like, you know, that is just a fix. It's a thing. It's a remedy to stop people from talking about the thing. Because when you really look at systems and really look at what's happening in this industry, and even looking at what's happening in battling between which now are unions, you know, AFTRA and SAG versus equity. What people are realizing is that all these issues about systemic holds on power. And I think people in this business are specifically understanding the kind of things that Black people have been talking about for a long time. These systems are not, everything about its pedagogy, everything about what it appreciates, everything about the way that white critics look at our work and judge our work, and they're judging our work from this paradigm of their own white privilege and in at worst white supremacist views. So it's like every way in the industry we get cut down. But again, it's the same systems that are about maintaining that power. And the dangerous thing about the theater and about art making is that within these ecosystems, because we assume that we all are liberal and we assume that or progressive, we assume that because we make things and we're theater kids or kids in the arts, that we have a certain understanding and empathy and compassion around these issues. And that is not the case. That the crave for power and control exists across the board, and we become the gatekeepers, the caretakers of those systems. And even as an African-American man in this business, recognizing all the privilege I have, going to Notre Dame, going to graduate school, my light skin privilege, I understand that growing up in New Orleans, I passed the brown paper bag test, I passed the fine tooth comb test. All of that stuff is a different experience for my darker brethren who work into this business. And part of my job is to understand that too. So it's a multifaceted question you're asking. But COVID has been the perfect, it's an awful situation, but COVID has forced us not only all to stop, but moving forward, we have to, and especially in the world, we can't do what we do. We can't make the way we used to make.
Right.
And I think that's okay. Because if this is going to compel people to stop and examine these systems once and for all, so be it. But this industry has to have a reckoning with this.
Rachel, I love the title of the play. I'm going to let you figure out how to say it on the webinar. But it's when Joe was talking, that's the first thing that I thought about. Can you talk a little bit about, you know what play I'm talking about?
I do know what play you're talking about. Can I curse on the webinar?
Why don't we use like the ing, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So the play is called I'm Effing Tired of Writing Plays About This. And like I got to a point in June where, I have some plays, I've got plays Well-Intentioned White People, I've got Good Bad People that are all surrounded and just drenched in Black trauma. And American theater loves those plays. Like I get hit up all the time where it's like, can you write another play like this one, this like specifically really traumatic play? Or we really love Well-Intentioned White People. Are you going to write a part 2? And it's like, but then I have these other plays that are all about Black joy and about like specifically just writing a play about Blackness that doesn't center on or require whiteness at all. Those plays are Apologies for Lorraine Hansberry, Black Mexican. And no one will touch them because it's not about whiteness. Whiteness is not part of that narrative. And I have a lot of people say, well, why aren't there white characters in this play? And so I wanted to write, I'm effing tired of writing plays about this because I am. I'm tired of being forced to write plays that are trauma-based and then asking actors who have to live that trauma all the time and then ask them to go on stage and like basically do what feels like minstrelsy for a white audience so the white audience can feel better. And go like, oh, look, like at least we're not those white people. And it's like, yes, you are. By making us do this, you are now part of the problem. And so that's been it. And so that's why I wrote that play. And I started with the whole, because it feels like all of the stupid plays start with the dinner scene. So I started it with the dinner scene. So I was like, all right, here we go, American theater. And then just slowly deconstructed it because I'm tired. I'm tired of, and I wrote it right after the George Floyd protests were happening. Or during, at the height of them, when they're happening outside my window. But another thing that I wanted to bring up that I feel is a huge problem that we don't talk about enough is the artistic director-playwright relationship. So here's what I feel like I experience way too often. A white artistic director is like, we need to do a Black play. It's time. And so they find a Black playwright that they like, and they're like, oh my gosh, I love your play, blah, blah, blah. But I could never be the dramaturg or director. So we're going to get you a Black dramaturg and director. And you're like, okay, great. Thank you so much for that. But then before that happens, they're like, but first we have some notes. So then this white artistic director gives playwrights notes. And then you have to change the play because they're not really suggestions, they're mandates. You have to change the play. And then you get in the room with your Black cast and your Black director and your Black dramaturg, and they're like, this doesn't make any sense. So you change it back. And then the artistic director swoops in about 2/3 of the way through rehearsal, makes the changes again. Again, they're not suggestions, they're mandates. And so it's like, even though you have the Black team, the person in power is ultimately still that white artistic director. They get the changes that they want. And then your choices are, you can stand up and say, no, I don't want to make this change. But then you get labeled as difficult, and they tell all their friends that you're difficult, and then you don't get work for a year or two. Mm-hmm. Or you make the changes, and then the white critics come and talk about how it's a bad play. Mm-hmm. It's a lose-lose situation. And American theater trapped us in this like weird little cycle of like, well, we're going to uplift Black voices, but all through the lens of this white artistic director who's been there for 40 to 50 years and will not step down. And that to me is like one of the core issues of American theater. And that's where it stems from, because it all trickles down.
And then in terms of like of your art and your artistry and wanting to get back in there, wanting to get back to the computer, wanting Joe to get back to the rehearsal room, although we're not going to the rehearsal room anytime soon right now. But I find for me, I just don't want to go. It drains me of my passion for this art, I think is the best way I can put it. Yeah. I'm wondering if you guys have any advice for us at Notre Dame about correctives. We're going to open up our season selection. We're all working to decolonize our syllabi. We're desperate for our students to feel included in the rehearsal room. Do you guys have any examples of best practices, things that you've seen either in, like, Rachel has her own theater company, like, are there ways that you've seen that it really does work? So do you have any examples that you can share with us of some corrective measures or just best practices?
Well, I would say first things first, I think that we have to, in the same way that we look at these practices, they can't be projects, add-ons, Band-Aids. It can't be a project. It has to be part of practice. Mm-hmm. What we also have to recognize is that this work costs. Mm-hmm. And it's a difficult thing. We don't like to talk about money, but I am. And I think that what we're talking about here is the cost of this kind of behavior, this systemic behavior, is that traditionally, whether it be that playwright or that Black theater company that's been producing that work in St. Paul, Minnesota for many, many years, before you decided you wanted to do one Black play a year, what kind of resources are you drawing? We have consistently had resources stolen away from our communities. And that's just a fact. And so with any institution committing to doing this work, you have to understand that it's going to require resources. I'll tell you a story, okay? My institution of Trinity Rep, which we're going through our own anti-racism reckoning moment right now, because the mistake that we made in talking about EDI, the Age of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, was that it all became about we would do a workshop, we would do a seminar, it was a one-off, we formed a few, affinity groups, but there was no accountability. There was no sense of that this was an institutionally driven thing rather than it simply being a thing that we're doing to get to an end goal, okay, of solving this problem. So I guess my biggest also piece of advice is that this work is slow work, and it takes a lot of time. And it also it's not just a matter of providing spaces and providing spaces for Black voices to say, but we need to listen. We need to listen intently to BIPOC voices. And what I am going to say is that may cost people something. I know that's a horribly scary thing to hear, but in unraveling all the ways that people have benefited from systems that have excluded others, that means that people have benefited more than others. And so in this age of COVID, as we have this sort of feeling that we need to condense, we have to be articulate enough to say that in this time when we are indeed having to make some choices around how we condense our institutions, we cannot downsize justice and equality and access, period. Because I'm gonna tell y'all something. What's different than when we talked during the age of EDI? Now, you will not survive as a program without doing this work. Nobody will be nobody will want to be a part of your program. The pedagogy will be something nobody will want to have a part of. You will not be reflective, I think, of the groundswell of energy in this country right now around transforming these theatrical spaces. And that's the same, I'm not telling y'all anything I wouldn't tell my theater. So this is the perfect time for this work, but it's slow work and it's going to cost. And we cannot go to our default issues of, well, we can't afford to, or also, the important thing is when you invite people into these spaces, you better make sure that you can say, come over for Thanksgiving dinner, but if you ain't got no food, that's a problem. Or there are no utensils or a way to eat and feed them. And I've come into many, many situations where white institutions want to do Black work and produce Black work, but they're not ready to do that. And that becomes even more of a destructive practice. That sets you back years when you do that, because trust is all you got. And so make sure that you have the infrastructure that can support the needs of these artists and in ways that you probably don't know now, but that's why you're doing the work, so you can understand those ways that you need to be responsive to and provide the recipes to make that nourishment a reality when you invite them in. So that's my advice I would give on a broad scale about moving forward in any of this work.
No, I think that's wonderful. I was reading two things that you reminded me of. One is solidarity will require sacrifice. And I'm kind of letting that sit in my brain. And then the other is, I can't remember where I read it. And this is terrible because I can't attribute it to the person, but it was advice to young graduate students. And what the person said was, look them in the eye and ask them what they're doing for BIPOC students and to decolonize their syllabi and their season. And if they blink, if they cough, if they look away, move on. And I think that's it. We have the responsibility to be able to look people in the eye and answer that question honestly. Yeah, for sure. Rachel?
Yeah, Joe, your answer was so fantastic. Like, it's hard to follow it. I will say that, like, a thing, I think a lot of people, there's this idea that, oh, it's too big, it's too much, it's too much to take on, I can't do it. And I mean, I think that's a tool of white supremacy, of making something seem hard so you don't ever have to do it. And you can excuse yourself from it, when it's just as simple as like changing your vocabulary is a really easy way to decolonize your syllabus. Instead of saying this is theater history 101, say this is Western theater history, and add in other theater histories as well. And then, oh, look, you've already solved a problem. And just really kind of changing the way that we look at, the way we look at the way theater history is taught, the way we look at the way play analysis is taught, script analysis is taught, like just really looking through and like saying, like, I remember like something that a dramaturg suggested that would be added is like, what is the cultural background of this playwright? And like really diving into that. That's such a simple ad, and like really understanding what a full-on cultural background, how that informs the play. And so there's a way to look at it, be like, oh, we have so much to do and we just can't do it. It's like, just start doing something, do a thing, make a choice, make it intentional, and add it to make it where it can keep happening. Don't just do it for a semester. Like you said, like, don't just do a season, make it so that every time you add something in, it stays and you just keep building on it, rather than treating it as if it's decolonizing as this huge obstacle when it's not. The fact that like there's theater history courses and there's not a single mention of like kabuki theater, and a lot of it is like absurd. When that's like a massive contribution to our theater today. And so it's just really saying, like, who am I leaving out of the conversation when I teach the syllabus, and how can I add them in? It's that simple to me when you decolonize the syllabus. Who's left out?
That's great. Thank you. That's great. Go ahead, Joe, please.
Because I'm so vibing off y'all. I mean, you're making me think. And speaking of, decolonization too, presently, as we teach, and, for all of us, and I empathize with professors and teachers, because basically we spent the summer developing whole new syllabi and whole new pedagogies. But something as simple as, I told my students, and I was a little afraid day one when I was teaching my scene study class at Emerson, my first day, and I said, y'all, I'm gonna try something different here. First of all, with the technology, y'all gotta help me out. If I'm leaving somebody out who is trying to get into this room, let me know. Number one, I'll try not to hang up on you. Number two, but number three, I need you to help me, because what I'm not gonna do is walk into this class and say, you have to play X role in the scene, or me start off this class, I barely know y'all, of trying to decide how I'm gonna cast y'all, or what would you, I'm not gonna start your journey off in this business as one of your first acting coaches to begin to other you and say what I think you are. So that's gonna require me to read a hell of a lot more plays. And that's gonna require a lot more work from all of us, but we gotta do that. We got to do that. We got to read a few extra more plays, and you have to allow me the space to be a little bit more responsive to you. And I'm giving you license and agency to say, what do you want to do? And trust me, I'm gonna teach you how to act. I'm gonna teach you how to act, but I need to give you some license and agency right now, because I don't want to perpetuate those same things that I've been having to unravel about my career and myself, about my work, since I'm a 49-year-old man. So it's been a while, but it's an ongoing process of trying to unravel all that mess. And I'm gonna try my best not to be a party to that starting now. And so it's about transparency too. So that's another little way that I've found about this decolonization. Also providing any way, there are wonderful lists being constructed now of, before you reach the death of a salesman, there are wonderful BIPOC alternatives to those plays. And we also have to just have this freedom to open up our canon, because the canon has been closed for so long, and we've also reserved these things to being, quote, new play development, which is another way of like kind of othering something. That we have to really embrace this work as it's not, yes, it's a play that will get its first premiere, but we need to really be careful about when we talk about that we don't put a value on that work because it's new work. Because often new work, it also means / experimental, it means / it could be weird, / our white audiences may not like it, / and then by the time you do all that, you're not producing the play. And a lot of it comes out of, you don't understand that really. So that's a whole nother thing in terms of what I'm teaching myself, is I have to really continue to expand. I've worked in the jazz aesthetic with the Urban Bushwomen. I've done all these things I take my philosophies from all kinds of places, but I'm trying to continue to do that and continue to be inquisitive about what it is that I'm using and how I make my own work. So that's just another little thing about decolonization.
There's this idea of decolonization, and then you guys both mentioned this idea about identity. And when I am casting students, when I cast students in certain roles, then you made me actually think back to what it did to my identity to be cast in the roles in which I was cast for so many years. I'm going to take some time with that. I'm not going to take it here, but but when someone puts you in a box, right, or a role, that has an effect on you and your psyche. When I ask my senior students to identify what their type is, right, they have been typed, and I'm asking them to pull that out. And I think I'm going to change the question as a result of this conversation, because that's not fair. You have been typed. Now let's type ourselves. So thank you for that. I'd like to talk a little bit about allyship, specifically at Notre Dame and in the Notre Dame Theater. I'm wondering what your expectations are from allies. What does it mean to be an ally? Does it demand discomfort from the ally? Is the ally always going to be somewhat uncomfortable? I've mentioned to the faculty and to some of my students, I was doing a panel in London last year when we could travel, and my friend Monica Ndunu was on the panel with me, and she said, I'm done with allies. I want an accomplice. And I just absolutely love that term. But I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about allyship and what your expectations are. What your needs are, what your expectations are, what your wants are, what your desires are. I'm just rephrasing it while you think.
I am so at a place with allies right now.
Okay, that's okay too. That's okay too.
I think the issue, I really like the idea of the accomplice versus the ally. Of course, it requires discomfort. The issue with allyship in the age of social media is that it's become so much about appearances.
Oh, it's signaling, sure.
So little about actually, one of the funny things I like to talk about when it comes to allyship is when George Floyd happened, right? Mm-hmm. And he was brutally murdered in the street, and the video, first of all, stop sharing the videos on Facebook. If you have a single Black friend, do not share the videos. That's trauma porn, it's triggering, and the videos sometimes autoplay. So I just want to make sure to say that, like, please never share those videos. We don't need them. But also, so it was just funny because like that all summer, I had white friends messaging me like, hey, are you okay? Do you need anything? Like, what, how can I help you? Can I send you groceries? And like, all of my Black friends and I started talking, which was Black friends, but all my friends of color and I were talking, like, are white people messaging you? And it's like, yeah, I'm getting a lot of messages from white people. And it's like, okay, why? Like, was there like a white conference where everyone got together and was like, we should message our Black friends? And like, that is what I think of when I think of allyship, of this, like, I had so many people messaging me over the summer and I have not heard from them in months. And it's not like George Floyd was the last person to be killed by the police at all. And so it just, that's my issue with allyship, is that it feels like something that's just a checkbox. Sometimes it's like, oh, I messaged my Black friend, I sent her $20 for groceries, I'm not a racist. And that's not, it requires consistency. It requires to constantly be uncomfortable. It is not discomfort just once and then you get used to it. You are constantly, you need to be uncomfortable. You need to not, I remember we did this like training at my job that I just left, where it was an all white space and I was the only BIPOC at all. I was the only person of color on staff. And we spent the first 30 minutes of them apologizing over and over again. Like, I'm gonna say something wrong. I know I'm gonna say something wrong. And the fact that the facilitator did not stop them was infuriating. So I like, because I had my camera off, I turned my camera on and I was just like, we cannot center white guilt while we talk about anti-Blackness. Like, that's not, this is the wrong approach. And so for me, I don't know what the word ally means anymore. And I think that it's been deeply perverted and changed, and it is almost meaningless now. And so I definitely would prefer someone who is okay with constant discomfort, is okay with, like, I'm here to listen. Like Joe said, it's about listening and not just, oh, I did a thing today, I'm not racist. And I will stop ranting now.
No, that's okay. I have also gotten several apologies and I was like, stop apologizing to me and go do something. Joe?
I agree 100%.
All right. Yeah, I think that that's a really difficult one, because there are, and without any possibility of a doubt, people who want to help. But again, do they want to sacrifice? Do they want to give something up? Do they want to step down? Do they want to step back? Do they want to stop congratulating themselves for what they are doing and take some ownership for what they haven't done? And with that, I will stop ranting. So the students, if you guys, students, faculty, anybody who's here, if you guys want to start sending in questions, I have another question for these guys. And I have another, I had one student former student who sent in a question with the RSVP. So we'll have time to get to that one too. So you guys have seen this question, but I'm gonna break it in half. Are we in a transformative moment for BIPOC artists? Is that what's happening? It feels like we're in a transformative moment, but it might be my first one. So how would I know if it's real or not? How do you guys feel?
I don't know.
Yeah. Is it real? I mean, is the ground solid? I think is my question. Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't know because without getting too political, I mean, there's so many other things right now operating in our frame right now in this country that things could go a number of ways. You know, I just want to go back to what's already been said. You know, George Floyd wasn't the first person of color that we've witnessed being murdered on film. He wasn't the first. And look where we are now.
It wasn't the last, yeah.
Wasn't the last, so it wasn't the first, wasn't the last. So my expectations, you know, it's complicated. But again, there are also so many things politically on the horizon that this country has to grapple with, that it could go a number of ways. I think that this is going to be hard work, and people are going to resist. It's going to be difficult work.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where I am with is this a seminal moment? I hope so, but I'm not sure.
I think it is a little. I do. Maybe I'm just naive and dumb and young, but like I think that it feels really what feels transformative about it, and like Joe kind of said in the beginning of the conversation, is that COVID is horrible, but it has forced us to pause. but it's also forced us to reconsider resources. Like, I know so many BIPOC artists who are like, I don't need theaters anymore. They're just going to do a crappy digital production of my play so I can do my own crappy digital production of my play and keep all the money. So like, that's kind of, and so it just feels like a lot of people are taking their power back, because without that magical space, it's expensive, super expensive to rent a theater space, to run one, but now that it's all on Zoom, which is like $15 a month if you pay for the pro version, people are taking so much power back by saying, I can do this myself. And that part in itself feels really transformative, even if it's just a reminder that we don't need the institutions, they need us. And that's a reminder that I felt very strongly over the summer. I was like, wait a minute, I'm realizing theater companies are suddenly doing things they called impossible, because they're realizing they're losing artists, and losing us is a much bigger risk for them. And that was a nice transformative personal moment for me. And so I don't know that it's going to be as big as I want it to be, but I do think something slightly transformative has happened.
When this all first went down, and all we had were like Zoom webinars going on all over the place. I watched one, Joe, you might have seen it, was in Boston. It was the Boston Globe did it, and it was all BIPOC artists. And they were talking about what their hopes. It was the beginning of COVID, and I mean, nobody expected this to be going on for as long as it is, right? I had a show going up. I thought I'd give it a month and then we'll go back and do it. But they were talking about they were saying that we have to reimagine this landscape. We have to imagine what we want it to be. And at that point, my brain couldn't come up with anything. But now, 6 later, 245 days later, as I write in my journal, I've had some time in the pause to start to see other things. Can you guys talk a little bit about what you hope for the new American theater landscape? What your thoughts? What we best I don't know, dreamy dream, as my friend would say. What's your dreamy dream for this new landscape?
Well, my dream is that we hopefully will understand better as we move to this new space, that once and for all, that art making and art is not a transactional experience or a transaction. It has to remain, and is and has to remain, a transformative experience. And we always want to transform our audiences. We've gotten to this place where we even want to dictate what we think they need to see, what we think they need to feel, what we think they need to talk about. And so I really hope that our theaters and our art making spaces truly can become spaces where it is of, by, and for people again. And I hope that we, once again, can do away with terms like community theater, meaning semi-pro. Say semi-pro, say non-union, or whatever you want to say, but don't use community theater as this sort of badge of it's not very good theater. Every theater should aspire to be a community theater, of, by, and for people. And I think that in that way, it's not just a matter of us transforming people's lives, but that collectively we are engaged in a conversation of transformation and transcendence. And I do want to say too, I hope I don't as being too pessimistic about the state of where we are, because I've never actually felt more engaged in my life. And even I tell my students, don't be sad, because we in this classroom, we making something. We making something. Yeah. In the words of John Lewis, even if it's not a piece of artwork, we're still making a little good trouble. We're making something. We're making something. We're doing something. And I feel alive right now. I feel engaged right now. And this work is tough. It's tough. But we're having conversations in these theatrical spaces that we've never had. And you think, my God, we explore all these worlds, all these cultures, all these stories, all these characters. The conversations that we're having right now, I mean, I think they're remarkable, actually. So I do too. I do have great hope, but it's going to be tough. But my pessimism comes from, even as I reflect upon COVID. I guess I really freaked out when I began to think about how would we respond to this pandemic as a collective? What would it look like for us to have collective responsibility as a country? And so I guess my big hope for the theater is that we can become less driven by this idea of what we produce, what our outcome is, and more about what it should be is facilitating conversations and having as many voices around that campfire as possible. Yeah.
Okay, did I cut you off? I didn't mean to. Okay, great. I want all of those things, but one like very specific thing I want is a transfer of power. I really want to see some of these people. There was this great roundup that Playbill did where it was like people of color that are stepping up into leadership positions during COVID, and like seeing kind of a little bit of a transfer of power happening there. But we really need, I mean, some of these artists, like I've said already, you can kind of tell where my frustrations with a little bit today. Some of these artistic directors have been at their companies for 50 years. Like, that's too long. That's way too long. And so what I'd really love to see is that not only stepping back and stepping down, but also making it so that the BIPOC person that you hire to take your place, that you set them up for success, but you don't just walk away. Because I've seen that happen a lot too, where they hire someone who's BIPOC, but then give them no tools on how to succeed. They don't tell them about the board, and then they fail and they're not successful. And so I'd really love to see a transfer of power that happens in a real, genuine way and in an honest way that uplifts the voices that we've been ignoring for way too long.
Yes, and say it, because we're also talking about, this is why we're talking about how theater has to once again be the model we imagine the worlds that we want to live in, and we explore these worlds in, I think, a really incredible sense in the theater. But let's imagine it has to, I think when we talk about structures of power, it's like, even when I'm talking to my students as an actor versus as I'm talking to my directing students, it's like, I'm not training actors to have to rely upon a director to tell them where to move, how to move, what to do, what to say. It's like, I think that I don't even like that idea of the hierarchy of what is the purview of a director and what is the purview of that actor. I want all of my actors to be people who can take care of themselves first and foremost, but they should be thinking big vision too. They should be thinking big picture too. So that said, you know, we can have transformations on the artistic sides of theaters. We can, you know, split up power and do all these things, but that has to be matched with that same kind of power sharing on the executive side. Those people making decisions around marketing and budgets and how we raise money and where those resources go to. And that is a setup right now. And that's going to be the big tension, I believe, in institutions going forward, is that, you know, there is the artistic side that has suffered as a result of COVID. Many of these institutions are now being held up because of the business side. And so there's going to be a vacuum happening here because artists are unemployed. We're not working. We're not in the theater.
Right.
But yet you have also these people trying to develop policies around anti-racism. So we have to be in these space. So there's a tension that's going to come to a head here. So we have to think about radically shifting power sharing across the board. This can't be a primarily artistic thing, and that doesn't touch executive. Executive has to be a part of that conversation as well, because that's where the power lies. It lies where the money is.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's been a shift? I'm sort of feeling it, where it used to be, as an actor, I just showed up, wore what you told me to wear, did what you told me to do, and then, you know, got my flowers at the end, got my review, went home and went on to the next job. And for me, over the past like 5 years or so, I don't want a director. I don't want you to tell me what to do, and I don't want you to tell me what to wear. And I wonder, I'm hearing that from not just actors, but I'm hearing that from designers and from playwrights, where unless everyone's at the table having a conversation where we're weaving something together, I'm no longer interested in the old hierarchical structure. Yeah.
No. Same.
yeah.
Same.
Yeah, I can't work that way anymore. I don't want to.
But I also think my work is better when I work in a collaborative way, you know, and that's also going to require all of our institutions, whether we're talking about the academy or talking about the theater, that we have to find a way. I mean, Notre Dame's a big school. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of cogs. And Trinity Rep is one of the oldest institutions in the country, regional theaters, one of the biggest. And these institutions don't like to move quickly. They don't have the ability to be responsive. And one of the things that we're gonna have to grapple with is, how do we build in mechanisms that we can be a little bit more responsive? Because I think that's also one of these old modes of how we produce work, and we produce work in our own time frame. And so we really aren't having many conversations with the community. We're only having conversations with them based upon trying to get them to buy a ticket to come and see our show, or trying to recruit them to come to our institutions. So, yeah.
I'm going to nudge the audience a little bit. So We've wrapped up pretty much all of the questions I have. It is probably clear to everyone that the three of us can and will continue to talk until 3 o'clock. We don't have any problem with that, but I really want to invite you guys to share some questions that we can have Joe and Rachel respond to. Do you guys have any ideas about, I mean, my thing right now is we're in a pause, but we'd really like to open up the theater space so that more BIPOC students know that this is a place that doesn't just need them in it, wants them in it, needs them in it. It's a place for you. Do you have any ideas about ways that we can, I don't know, help us to throw our doors open?
I guess the first thing that popped into my head was, you know, and maybe I'm exhibit A because I wasn't a theater major. I think that my experience over being involved in many different institutions across the country is that I think sometimes there is, and this goes to anti-racism, goes to all the practices that we're talking about. How I came to the arts is not like how everybody else may have come to the arts. It's always a very personal thing for people. For me and for my parents, it was a luxury item. It was a thing that we could afford to do or not afford to do, okay? And so my experience in art making was I sang in the choir. My experience with art making was I was involved in speech and debate, or I did this kind of club thing, or I would do this little performance thing in the community. And so even in terms of how we recruit talent, how we think about where we find and expand the participants, i.e. students, into our programs, I think we have to be really careful that we're not creating a bubble around majors and around being a theater major, because there may be a Black kid or some BIPOC kid singing in a choir who would serve in wonderful ways to be opened up by being welcomed into a theatrical environment where their talent is being appreciated for what it is. But we have to reshape how we think about what value is before we can even do that. You know,
Agreed.
That we can't just, because those of us who love the theater are out there, but we have not been a part of this as many folk are, and because of access issues. And because and this access gets handed down. Like my parents' didn't go to the theater because they couldn't afford it and they didn't have a value for it. I went if we had a school trip to go to anything, you know? So we just automatically also assume that we all have the same kind of relationship to it through, if we want to be a major, that means I'm interested, or if I show up, that means I'm interested. And there's all kinds of ways to cultivate and expand our community by looking at untraditional communities that we haven't looked to before because we haven't valued them as being able to contribute.
Yeah, so yes, and for me, it's that, yes, everything you said. I was on this panel where someone said something that was kind of stuck with me, and what she said was that before you ask about why they're not here, think about who's been hurt here first. And I think that one of the first ways that you can think about how do we get more BIPOC people even through the doors, and I think you've already done this, is having that conversation of like, who's been hurt and how have they been hurt? And how can we learn and make sure that we promise not to do that again? Because what happens is you talk to your friends, you know, a lot of my friends were also BIPOC and they'd ask me about my theater, and I'd be like, theater classes, and I'd be like, oh yeah, we're reading this weird play. We're reading another, you know, and like, I had a friend who was like, I was gonna take a theater class, but I don't want to read those plays. So we talked to our friends while we're in the dining hall, we talk to our friends and they hear from us. And then that's kind of how that spreads out. And so first understanding like who's been hurt and how you can reckon with that and how you can apologize. And then also opening theater. So I know for me growing up, like Joe said, it was a huge luxury. We did not go to the theater. I thought I was going to be a corporate defense attorney throughout most of college, which is hilarious now. And it's because it's like, so I was always told theater is for white people. Like that's not for us. And so kind of showing BIPOC students, like one, look at your seasons and the shows that you do. Some of them, English student classes, that's where you got to go. The English students are the ones to steal because a lot of them are interested in theater. But like if they see like Blithe Spirit, they're not going to come and switch their major. But like, what shows are you doing? Are they just August Wilson and Lorraine Hansberry? Have you talked about other Black playwrights? Have you talked about playwrights that are alive and writing right now? And like I said, y'all are doing that, but continuing to do that work and making sure that it stays consistent, people will notice. There's a reason people go where they feel welcomed. And theater just historically has not felt very welcoming. I still struggle with whether or not it's welcoming now. And I'm like in it, I've given my life. So I think it's people look at your shows more than you think. People look at your syllabus, the plays you put on your syllabus, and more than you think.
No, that's super helpful from both of you. I'm keeping kind of an eye on time here. I want to do a couple things. I want to thank both of you so much for coming and talking with me this afternoon. It's been really, it's fed my soul. So I hope that the audience has enjoyed it as well. I want to remind the audience about our third event, which is the ND Anti-Racist Theater Now, scenes from plays by BIPOC artists. They're going to be directed by our very own FTT alumni, including one of our panelists, Rachel Lynett, who wrote and will direct a scene from her play called Last Night. In the chat, we're including links both to those Zoom readings and to that LA Times article that I mentioned earlier. But in closing, is there anything else you guys would like to say? I'm just so overjoyed that we did this.
This has been a gift. It's been a great gift. And I'm here to say that I'm speaking to our friends out here as also being knee deep in the process as well. That we're all in it together, and it is difficult work, and it's messy work, and it should be messy, and that's okay. I think in the same way that we like to wallow in the mess in the rehearsal hall, we kind of revel in that process being as messy as it is, and wrestling with those characters and asking those tough questions and battling each other, sometimes from our own character points of view. That I think that we have to carry that same kind of intensity and that same kind of commitment and consistency with this work. And that's all I have to say. I'm just so grateful to be here. This has brought back a lot of memories for me. And I think what is the gift about this is also, this is about storytelling. And the more that we can give people the chance to really tell their stories, I think is also, if we say that's what we're about as a profession or as an art form, then let's really be what that's about providing spaces for those stories to happen. And then we listen to those stories. And the last piece of advice I would give is to not just take your time with feeling like you have to respond, because quite frankly, you don't quite know what you're responding to. And so to find out what you're responding to, you have to really be present, and you have to listen to these collective stories, and some of that will reveal trauma, and that will be a result of that system. But don't stop at taking that as an indictment of you. That's where the allyship comes in, that dangerous word.
Right.
It's staying open and available enough then to hear that, and then from there develop a plan. But let's be careful about being too reactionary right now, because you don't know the full story, because we're not allowing spaces to really hear those things right now. We're trying, but allow it to be messy, allow it to be hard. Open up these conversations, have these conversations, and keep doing the work.
I love it. Thank you both so much. Let's go tell some stories. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.